Hello, my name is Dr. Tom Bennett. I'm with the Battleship New Jersey and the Kane University Oral History Program. Today is November 20th, the year 2009. We're aboard the Battleship New Jersey, and I'm talking today with Mr. Al Saggese of Havertown, Pennsylvania, who served with the uh, Army Cavalry Unit 1946 to 47 and in the Ready Reserves from 1947 to 1950, and he served with an MOS of 745, which was infantry. Al, I want to thank you very much for talking with us today.
Sure.
Let's start off the conversation. How did you get to be involved with the Army?
Okay. I really have to rewind all the way back to the 30s, I guess. World War One was then relatively close to the 30s. 1918, that was the war to end all wars. My dad, who came from Italy in 1915, was drafted into the American Army, even though he was not a citizen. So he was sent back to France, and he served a year and a half in France in World War One. Of course, we all have our fathers as heroes, and he was my hero. In our basement, I had a old-fashioned World War One helmet, and as a kid, I used to play soldier, as most kids in those days did. There wasn't an onus on being in the military then. I mean, it was considered something patriotic. Also, I had an uncle who was in the Navy in World War One, and he too was my hero. So I kind of grew up with a military bent. I thought that was a great experience. I thought it'd be really great to serve your country, even though I was only 12, 11, 12 years old. And most of the kids that grew up in my era felt the same way about the military. We thought it'd be a great experience. But we never dreamed that we would have the chance to go into the service. Also, as an early recollection, we used to visit, and this may be a little bit off the course, but we used to visit my grandfather's grave, and two graves away was a um, the grave of a soldier who was killed in World War One. It was a life, actually a full size um, sculpture of a soldier at attention. And when I'd visit the gravesite, I spend more time at the soldier's grave than at my grandfather's grave. So I guess to say that I had a kind of a penchant for things military, even as a young kid. And in those days, there was like today, they have baseball cards. They had something called war cards. And this was in the 30s. And these war cards were images of Japan and China. You buy a penny piece of bubble gum and you get this war card. Again, my mind was filled with images of, boy, how great it must be to be at war, which little did I know how terrible it really was. But at any rate, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, I was stunned, but also happy. And I thought, well, this is our chance to get into war. And I told my father, and he said, don't think war is great. He said, it's terrible.
How old were you when Pearl Harbor was attacked, by the way?
Let's see, that was 1941, so I was at 28, 38, 39, 40, 13. And we lived in a section of Philadelphia that was not quite developed. There were a lot of empty fields. And as kids, we developed what we thought was a great thing, home defense. And we would drill over in the park and wait for the Germans or the Japanese or the Germans to invade America. We thought, boy, it was imminent. At any rate, early in that war, everybody in my family, every male, without exception, went into the service, and even some of the females. I had a cousin who was a nurse, she went into the service, and one went into the Red Cross. So I was devastated that I was kind of too young to get in. But as the war drug on, I thought, well, my chance is going to come. My brother served in Europe, in France, with the infantry, 28th Division, Pennsylvania, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge. And again, I thought, what a hero my brother was. We all look up to our own family. And as the war drug on, I was a senior in high school, and in my high school, they had what they called the Victory Corps because we all thought we would be drafted into the Army and possibly um, be part of the invasion of Japan. So we had basic training in high school. We had um, rifle training, drill. Also, there were various stages of training in the maintenance of Jeeps, and I still have some of the books that date back to the 40s.
Al, who would conduct this training for you?
The teachers.
Teachers would.
Yes.
Teachers who had been in the military, perhaps?
Well, they would send people from the Army over just to give us the basic drilling and rifle instruction, and was called the Victory Corps. And of course, the war ended, and I thought, geez, I lost my opportunity, but I was determined to get in anyway, because with demobilization, they were demobilized, and yet they needed troops overseas. So the Army encouraged volunteers, which I volunteered really. I wanted to get into the Navy, but because I wore glasses, the physical was a little tougher. But the Army did accept people with glasses, so I went into the Army and took my basic training in Fort McClellan, Alabama. And after 9 weeks, I was sent overseas to Japan, the occupation. Again, they needed personnel. So as they were demobilizing the combat veterans from the Philippine Islands and the war in the Pacific, we were taking over as garrison troops. The images I have of Japan, of course, we all realized how brutal they were, or let's say how brutal they were in battle. When we got to Japan, I was surprised at the devastation. I thought, well, how could these people have fought such a war? I mean, Tokyo was in ruins. I mean, there was nothing there. I mean, there were actually block after block of nothing but demolished buildings. Also, the countryside. I thought this is almost primitive. And how could they have fought as hard as they did for 4 years? At any rate, I was sent to an area right outside Tokyo, the Japanese naval base between Yokohama and Tokyo.
Was that Yokosuka?
Yokosuka, yes.
Naval Base. I was there too, by the way.
Okay.
Yokosuka.
And I saw that was only a few ramshackle buildings left. I mean, that too was completely destroyed. Yokohama was destroyed. So the devastation in Japan was almost beyond comprehension when I look back on it. We knew about the atom bomb, but I knew that we were bombing them incessantly, but I did not realize how much damage our bombs really did. But at any rate, our duty was to maintain order, destroy their munitions, because they stockpiled a tremendous amount of munitions. They had thousands of planes left that they were going to use for kamikaze attacks.
And what kind of airplanes were these? Do you recall?
I do not recall. They were basic small planes, the ones that I saw anyway. Probably on the line of a small Zero, but at that time I had no idea.
And were you involved in the destruction of these airplanes?
We were involved in the destruction of a lot of their small arms. There were rifles and bayonets and pistols, and in some areas we just dumped them into the bay, and then I guess that kind of made it so they'd never be able to be used again. But what struck me was the total lack of almost basic services because of our bombing raids. I mean, even the food was in such short supply that there were literally people laying on the streets of Tokyo, and I have pictures of them. But at any rate, our job was to maintain order, especially at night. We were on patrol in the various little towns. Some of them that I recall was Takayama, Zushi, Hayama. Hayama was close to where the Imperial Palace, Summer Palace was. And for a brief time, I believe it was because of my size, I was selected to go to Tokyo as part of a detachment that was really more of a show detachment than a military. Not, it was military, but they wanted to show how big the Americans were compared to these puny Japanese that were undernourished and small. And also the Australians and the Russians had their best looking troops there. So the fact that I was 6 feet tall, I was sent to Tokyo. And for a brief time, I acted as an honor guard for MacArthur. We had carte blanche as far as uniforms were concerned, so that we put the image of modern big soldiers. Part of the duty there was, like I said, to maintain order. But one incident that I do remember very vividly, a lot of turmoil in Japan. The Cold War had just started, I guess, and the communists were vying for getting power in Japan. They were organizing they were trying to organize some of the workers into unions, and MacArthur, who was a very strict administrator, forbade any kind of demonstrations. So a lot of our training was crowd control. We expected trouble. It was in March, I believe, of 1947 when they called for a general strike throughout Japan. MacArthur expressly forbade it. And nonetheless, the planning went on. It was communist inspired, I know that. The planning went on to have this strike. So he ordered a parade of military strength that was probably the largest anyone had ever seen. He called units from all over Japan and the surrounding island, I think it was Formosa, at that time it was called Formosa, to assemble in Tokyo. And we had a parade that lasted 9 hours. We had tanks and artillery, and toward the end of the parade, they had an overflight of B-29 bombers, which the Japanese people were terrified of. Much is said about the atom bomb, but actually the B-29s did more damage than the atom bomb. Well, anyway, they flew as low as they could possibly fly in Tokyo, and the people literally were paralyzed when they saw these bombers flying overhead, followed by flights of fighter planes. Needless to say, the demonstration collapsed. The parade actually lasted 9 hours. We actually assembled on the Imperial Palace grounds, which up to that point had almost been off limits. And MacArthur at that time, and I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure, they issued the first occupation medal, Army of Occupation of Japan, that day. And it was a big ceremony there. And I still remember, I have some pictures of the parade itself. So that was one image that was burned in my mind, that he was a great administrator, but he didn't. Go ahead.
What was MacArthur like? Did you ever get to talk to him?
No, although my friend did. He was down to earth to the GI, but he had a certain image, an aloof image. I mean, you almost were hesitant to talk to him. I mean, he had a burning look in his eye. He was always came across as a stern individual, and I guess that was an image that he wanted to develop. But to get back to the garrison duty, many of our, what I recall, we used to go into these small towns and villages, 2 men, and we'd walk for 4 hours, really, almost like policemen, to make sure everything was going well. I remember some of there was the beginning, I guess, of black marketing, some pilfering going on in some of our depots, so we had to be very careful of that. Black market was a big part of the occupation. Many of the GIs participated in a small way by selling cigarettes. Cigarettes were as good as gold. The official rate of exchange then was 15 yen to the dollar. As part of the garrison, we were paid in script because the dollar was almost universally accepted as better than gold almost. So we were paid in script, so to kind of curtail any activity with the black market. But nonetheless, we would sell the cigarettes, which we were buying for 70 cents a carton. They were getting 2,000 yen, which would have been, if the official rate was 15 yen to the dollar, so you divide 15 into 2,000, that's how much we were getting for a carton of cigarettes. And they were used as barter primarily.
Now, by the way, when you walked around the towns, you mentioned in pairs, were you armed?
You were armed, yes, fully armed, and the pieces were loaded too. I mean, we had loaded
What did you
weapons.
carry for weapons?
Either a carbine or an M1 or a 45. If you were on actual MP duty, it was a 45. Other than that, you had either a carbine or an M1, which was a military rifle.
And what was your reaction to the Japanese themselves as individuals, as people?
Well, I was stunned that they were kind of, I would say they were placid, or let me say, the correct word for it, they were pathetic because they lacked so many basic things that we took for granted that they were almost like beggars. There was no food left. Your plumbing supplies were all devastated. So it was tough living for the average Japanese person. And they were very pliant to what the Americans wanted. So they looked up to us.
So then when you walked through a town in pairs, you really didn't fear being ever overtaken by Japanese or any anger towards you?
No, but practically every Japanese male was still in uniform because they didn't have any clothes and they were using their old uniforms. And at times we could feel the tenseness by looking at some of them. When you hit them right in the eye, you could see that there was a certain animosity toward the Americans. However, they were in such a condition that they couldn't offer any resistance, nor did I hear of ever having any resistance.
Was there any animosity of Americans towards the Japanese over, based on what had happened in Pacific fighting?
I didn't notice any, no. I think we were more ambassadors of goodwill at that time. We were trying to help them, especially the kids. I do remember one incident. I was in Tokyo, and there was a little bridge, and there was a Japanese soldier who obviously had been wounded in the war. He was sitting on the bridge begging, and I received a donut from the Red Cross, and I felt so sorry for the guy. I handed him the donut, and then I walked away. He thanked me profusely in Japanese, and I walked away. I was with a buddy of mine, and before I got 30 feet away, kids swooped down and grabbed the donut out of the. Well, that's how bad the hunger was there. So, to me, also in the mess halls, we had set up. They didn't have good plumbing, so we had set out outside the mess halls. We'd have these 55-gallon drums of boiling water. So you took your mess kit and you'd wash them outside. There were 3 different drums. Well, before you washed your or scraped your food off, these little kids were hanging around and just begging that you scrape the food into their can. They had like empty coffee cans. And again, it was pathetic. I mean, you're looking at the kids that were starving. The homes were not heated. And I thought, how could these people have fought such a long war and been so brutal? Also, one of the things I remember in Tokyo, of course, there were not too many automobiles, and they didn't have any fuel, but they were able to devise something that their automobiles ran on charcoal. And this charcoal smell from their little heaters in the house just permeated the entire environment of Tokyo, whatever their towns were. So I guess the most vivid memories of Japan is the destruction, the hunger, and the ragged condition that they were left in, the people. I would never have dreamed that they would have recovered from that kind of devastation in such a short period of time. And I believe the Korean War helped them come out of that because we start buying war material from Japan, or material.
How did the charcoal-driven cars function? Do they have a little
That,
steam engine in them?
I have no idea, and I'm going to look it up. But I do know either they must have converted that charcoal to a gas, or they must have kept their water boiling from that charcoal. But obviously, they did not have any fuel. Another thing that was important, we had to watch all our equipment because it was easily stolen, and before you know it, it would disappear. The Jeeps had chains on them so that you couldn't steal the Jeeps. They would take them apart in minutes. I mean, after a short period of time. So basically, I guess to look back on that period, I was very stunned to realize that these people could have fought a war and did. A lot of their equipment I looked at seemed substandard, although some of their equipment was very good. And again, I did what I thought was my duty to my country, and I wanted to fulfill the ambitions of my, or some of the experiences of my dad.
You mentioned that some of the equipment was good, some was shoddy. What was the good equipment? What was the shoddy equipment?
The tanks, they had a lot of tanks that were all, of course, they were all disarmed and disabled, but we would fire our M1s with armor piercing, and it would go through some of the parts of the tank, which was unbelievable. And I thought, my God, these tanks, there were some light tanks, obviously. Also, what impressed me was most of the communications were down, and part of our duty was to restore the communications. So we were actually working as linemen when they were putting poles up, running the lines so they would get some basic communication working. Again, their stores had nothing to sell. The people were hungry. A lot of starvation in Japan, in Tokyo and Yokohama. A lot of devastation, and it was an experience that, of course, burned in my mind.
How did the Japanese, we might have mentioned this before, but how did the Japanese react to the Americans?
Well, I think they realized that they were in such a position where they could not, even if they did not like our, I know they did not like us being there, they had no alternative because this was their only hope of getting some measure of security, and also the Americans were supplying a lot of food. As a matter of fact, we were not permitted to use any Japanese food because they had such little supplies left that we were instructed not to eat any. When we were told that the food was substandard and we shouldn't try to eat it anyway, but MacArthur did not. There was no edict preventing us from fraternizing, and I think that was part of his theory that he wanted to make friends of the Japanese rather than appear as conquerors. And to him, he had a way of administering probably that was a little different than they did in Germany. He encouraged fraternization, not encouraged it, but he permitted it. And also he wanted to give the image that we were there as friends, not as conquerors. I think it was one of the reasons they left the emperor in power. So that was another important factor of the occupation. Many of the Japanese military, the officers, were given jobs to disarm their troops because they'd be much more compliant to our wishes if they were coming through their own chain of command. So we were overseeing it, but many of the basic orders were coming from the Japanese officers from their previous units.
So by the time you're there in 1946, all the Japanese troops were disarmed and disbanded as military units, yes. I would assume.
Yes. Although they were still coming in from outlying areas, but they were disarmed by the time they got there. And their police, they had the basic police, but they were under our control. We were whenever we were into these towns, the little police headquarters were our headquarters. And so it was kind of a symbiotic relationship at that point. They were cooperating because they had no alternative, and their cooperation made our job a little easier. So the experience was not combat, but it was a firsthand look at an occupation that worked, and I think it probably proved that MacArthur's theories were the right ones, the correct ones. I mean, we went in more as tried to be friends, and after a year or so, there was very little hostility, a lot of cooperation.
Did you, while you were there, get to know any Japanese personally, any families,
Yes,
friends,
indeed.
and talk to
We
us a
all
little bit about
did actually. Well, there was one little town that they had a big, I guess it was a national kind of a holiday where I met this Japanese girl, and although we did have guidebooks and language books, basically you could after a while you learned how to speak. You know a few words of Japanese, but anyway, I befriended her, and I used to bring her food, and we became very close friends. And her dad apparently had served in China and been wounded in China. And at first he was very hostile to me, but seeing that I was probably a source of some of the uh, benefits that their little family could enjoy, um, I was kind of welcome there. And he did give me, before I left, a medal that he had received for his service in China. And I still have not been able to identify it. I have it, and I'm going to one of these days get to either the Japanese embassy or someplace to find out what this medal was for. I kind of believe it was for his service in China. But a number of these, well, many of the little families set up laundries or maybe a camera develop or picture developing just to make a few dollars, or do your tailoring. They were excellent tailors, and they were able to survive that way. So that was my experience, and again, it was not combat, but
What if we can jump with this family? What was their house like? What condition was it in? Was damaged by the war, or was it not?
the most of the houses, by our standards, would be the size of maybe a living room, and they were made of wood, very sparse, virtually nothing in them. There, some of the rooms, if they had more than two rooms, were served as living quarters and also sleeping quarters. The way they slept, they had these compartments that surrounded the room. They could open up, and they had these mats. Excuse me. They pulled the mats out, and they'd sleep on the mats. The kitchen consisted no more than I think they called it a brazier in the center of the room where they put charcoal and they cooked on it. No running water. It was just a basic shelter, not from the cold, but from the rain, because it was bitter cold in Japan in the winter, and even the barracks did not have any heat. There was no heat at all. We Most of the latrines were outside. It was not pleasant in that respect, but considering that it wasn't combat, it was tolerable. Getting back to Yokosuka, the naval base there was in shambles, and they were just clearing it all up when I got there.
Did you ever get to go into any of the caves at the naval base?
We went into the caves in the surrounding areas, and that was part of our duty to go into the caves. Some of them, they had been stored a lot of ammunition in there and weapons, but they were gradually all cleaned up. By the time we got there, we were just destroying them.
Did you ever, by the way, those caves later on be used by the Navy and Marine Corps as for facilities? And I went to one of those caves, deep into the cave, a couple hundreds of feet, where they had a cryptography school. And that was, you had to go through several guard points to get there. But those caves would be used later on. Yokosuka could be used as a naval base again.
Well, some of the caves from my recollection, They had tracks in there, but obviously they had some kind of small carriages going in there. They also had hospitals, so they were setting them up as hospitals, and also most of the ones that I saw were for storage, storing their ammunition, and they were way into the Japan is a mountainous country, so it was a very easy country to defend. And from what I saw, if we had not dropped the atom bomb and bombed them extensively with the B-29s, that would have been a tremendous battle. Everybody in Japan was prepared to defend the home island. I mean, they would have defended it to. They were.
That's something I wanted to ask you about. So, in your opinion, was it a good idea, do you think, to drop the two atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
Yeah, I have a little different slant on that. I believe it was the right idea to drop the bombs, but I do believe, from what I saw, the damage from the B-29s, that we would have been just as it would have been just as effective to continually bombing them with the B-29s. Their defense was practically wiped out, even though they had a lot of planes left. They were not of the caliber that could rise up and defend them against the B-29s, which were heavily armored, and the B-17s and our fighter planes then were superior. So they could have used them for kamikaze attacks, but I don't think they could have mounted an effective defense against our air power. By that time, the supplies coming out of America were overwhelming. When we were building ships, 14 days we were building merchant ships. We built, what, 500,000 airplanes, and most of their facilities were destroyed. So they had a few planes. I understand they had about 9,000 planes at the end of the war, and they were being husbanded so that they could use them as kamikaze planes. Their pilots did not have the training they needed, so they did not have an effective. Although they had a huge army, there were over 2 million Japanese soldiers that were still very capable, and they were in China, and they were going to bring them back to defend the home islands, but they were not necessary, obviously. And the Russians going in toward the end of the war, I believe, and I'm not a historian, maybe you could add to this, but I believe one of the reasons we dropped the atom bomb was to end the war before the Russians were able to get in and occupy part of the Japanese island. We did not want that to happen because even though the Cold War officially had not started, we realized that there were certain areas that the Russians were moving in too fast because their motives were a little bit suspect, especially in Europe when they were occupying parts of southern Europe, Austria, Bulgaria, Romania. They wanted that in the Russian sphere of influence, and this was their opportunity to get back to the Japanese. The Russians had lost in 1905. They were defeated by the Japanese, and that still smarted, and they wanted to take back, I believe, there's an island, I don't know how to pronounce it. Sakhalin Island.
Yep, yes.
And they would have taken that in no time.
They did take northern part of Sakhalin Island, but when we dropped the bomb, that sort of stopped their movement south, right?
And they would have invaded, and they would have come in. I mean, they would have had a big influence in Japan. And MacArthur realized that, or we realized that, and we wanted to prevent that. So I think in reflection, the atom bomb not only was necessary, but I think it saved us a lot of aggravation dealing with an ally, a so-called ally, who was shortly going to become an adversary. So I think that move was right. Asia, as you well know, is a very complicated area, and our being there probably prevented more serious problems for the United States, showing the way we did occupy Japan and making it a partner rather than an adversary.
While you're there, one thing, you're there 46, 47, 1948, Harry Truman integrates the military, had been segregated. Was there any race problems? How did the black soldiers fit in? How did the Japanese accept them? Because the Japanese were quite racially oriented, especially towards the Filipinos and the Chinese. Did you witness anything like that?
Yeah, now that you mention it, it brings back the 1st Cavalry Division was segregated. In the area of Tokyo, Yokohama, I don't recall seeing any black units. They did drive trucks and they were used in the kitchens, not the kitchen so much, but trucks and as service personnel. And there was some friction between those people, those troops, and the white units of the 1st Cavalry Division. Sorry to say that today, but there was. And there was, the Japanese even thought they were a little different, and they used to call them chocolatos, which was a kind of a disparaging term for them. And for the most part, there was integration. I mean, there was fraternization between some, but I didn't see too many black troops in the Tokyo, Yokohama area. But there was friction. And when we finally got back to the States, that's when Truman desegregated the units. But the 1st Cavalry, for all my services, was segregated.
Were you ever trained, by the way? You're sent to be an occupation force, but you're trained as an infantryman. Did you ever get any training in how to deal with civilians? Because you're in effect a large police force, not a military police.
Absolutely, yes. Now you bring that up, our training was crowd control. And we had a lot of training that way. And we used to use what they called, if I recall, it's called the flying wedge. And we were taught to, if there were unruly crowds, which a couple times there were, mostly from either dissidents, labor, we were to form in a sort of a triangle. And by moving into the crowd, we were taught to observe what individuals were the leaders of whatever turmoil was going on, and to go after them immediately, because we were taught that if you brought down the leader, the crowds would probably dissipate. And by using a wedge, there was always a stronger element behind you, and that's how we were taught to move into these crowds.
Did you use the wedge on occasion?
Only on one occasion. There was some turmoil, and I believe there was an election going on, but I was too young to realize what it was. And there were demonstrations. I believe it was in not Tokyo, but Yokohama. And the crowds were quickly dispersed. But we had much training on crowd control.
So there must have been, I guess, a sort of a deep-seated fear of civil disobedience,
They
civil
wanted to
rebellion.
keep, yes, because of the hunger, because of the primitive living conditions at the time. There were shortages of practically everything. That was a constant fear. And also around our depots where our food and supplies were, was constant surveillance, because hunger is a motivator that is hard to imagine when you're not hungry. So there were experiences that, to me, were the vivid images I have of some crowd control, the primitive conditions, the lack of sanitary facilities, of course, the lack of food, and even though it was looking back at Japan, compared to what I see on television today, it's eons apart. I mean, they were closer to being a medieval country than a modern country. So how they ever accumulated so many, their navy was almost second to none. So they put a lot of resources in armaments when they could have been building the infrastructure of Japan. So it was an unusual experience. And again, I thought, well, this was something that I wanted to do. I wanted to get into the military. Then when I saw, actually, to get back to my own family, my brother who served in Europe, the experiences he had were much more combat had much more to do with the actual combat of World War II.
You mentioned he was at the Battle of the
He
Bulge.
he was wounded at St. Lo, which was right prior to, it was wounded in August of 1944. And he was sent back into the line, and he was sent to an area of France, between France and Germany, called the Ardennes. And this was supposed to be an area that any prudent military person would not try to make engagement. It was more for arrest. The 28th Division was sent for arrest because they were mauled at St. Lo. Well, sure enough, this is where the Germans decided they were going to try one last-ditch offensive, and he then was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was cut off near the town of Bastogne, and again the 28th Division was whipsawed. They were issued white parkas, and they had escape maps, which I'm fortunate I still have at home, and some of the experiences he had. There was one experience right after the Battle of the Bulge when the German army was then collapsing, because after they lost that battle, they realized, even though there was tremendous resistance, they realized that the hopes of winning the war was over. Well, as they liberated these towns in Germany, there was one town, I believe it was called Kaiserslautern, whereas part of the 28th Division, they liberated a German camp that housed Russian prisoners. The Russian prisoners went on a rampage because they had some pent-up hatred of the Germans, and they were hearing stories of what the Germans had done in Russia. So this one released Russian prisoner was assaulting a German girl. My brother rescued her, prevented her from being raped. The father was so appreciative that he gave my brother this stein. My brother sent the stein home. On further investigating, this stein was from World War I. The girl's father had been in the German Navy, and the ship was called the Kaiserin. On the stein, engraved on the stein, is the list of the crewmen of the Kaiserin. And on top of the stein is a pewter lid, the German sailor. And he had a little telescope under his arm, and he looked through the telescope, he saw a German naval base. Well, anyway, further investigating, this ship, the Kaiserin, was turned over to the British after World War I as part of reparations, and it sailed to Scapa Flow to be given to the British. Well, the Germans had mined it and blew it up before it got into port. So I think that's a historic stein, and the more I look at it, the more I realize how unique that stein is. So some of the stories that he told me were even more interesting than mine. For instance, he was in on the only execution that the United States Army had against a deserter, an individual by the name of Eddie Slovak. He was called to possibly be part of the firing squad. And being a devout Catholic, he said, I could kill the enemy, but I can't see killing an American. So they excused him on those grounds, but he actually was part of the contingent that took Eddie Slovak to the area where they executed him. So I thought that was a pretty interesting story. But one of the
if I can cut in, did your brother say anything about whether he thought Slovak should be put to death? Recognizing that he's a young man at the time, he's in combat.
My brother was, I guess he had a lot of empathy, and this was after the war. After he had seen a lot of brutality in Europe, he did say that some men did crack, and he could understand that. So his theory was, even when he was fighting, he always thought, I'm killing somebody else's son, and it weighed on him. So yes, he did have even empathy for the enemy, but of course he did what he had to do. An interesting thing happened when my brother died. He lived in our old house, and it's 5 bedrooms. He lived alone. He was a bachelor, and in one of the closets there was a kind of a cache of artifacts from World War II, a German Nazi flag, a German helmet, and one thing I pulled out. Actually, my daughter pulled it out. Was a small duffel bag, and my brother's name was stenciled on it in black, but above it was another name, um, V, and I can't pronounce it, but something like Brzezinski, and a big X was through it. So I saw the bag probably had not been touched in 50 years. So I started wondering what happened to this. Who was this V. Brzezinski? So with a little sleuthing on the internet, I resurrected a name from somebody in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I was able to, again, through some research, find a telephone number. And I called the number, and an old woman answered the phone. And I said to her, "Is there a V. Brzezinski who lives there?" "Yes, Virgil. I'm pronouncing the word wrong, but the name wrong. But yes, a Virgil Brzezinski." I said, "Was he in World War II?" And a crackly old voice said, "Yes." "Was he in the Battle of the Bulge?" She says, "Yes." I said, "Well, I have something that you might be interested in." And she's "Here, I'll let you talk to him." So again, this old gentleman gets on the phone, and I said, "I have something here." I said, "It belongs to you." And he said, "What is it?" I said, "It's a duffel bag." So I didn't hear anything. I said, "Sir, are you still there?" He said, "Oh my God." He said, "I lost that duffel bag." I said, "Well, would you like to have it back?" I said, "I'd love to have it back." So anyway, I packed it up. I mailed it to him with a letter. And I said, "Dear Mr. Brzezinski, um, this was found in my brother's artifacts, and I'd be glad to let you have it. Obviously, it means a lot to you." So I said, "All I want from you is a letter stating what you did in the Battle of the Bulge." And never heard anything. So about 3 or 4 weeks went by, and I thought, geez, he didn't even bother sending me recognition that he received the bag. So I sent him another letter, and I said, "Dear Mr. Brzezinski, obviously that bag didn't mean as much to you as it does to me. Please send it back to me, and I'll pay for the postage." Didn't hear anything. Then about a month later, I got a letter from Atlanta, Georgia, and it was his daughter, and she apologized for not responding, and she said my dad was dying, and as a matter of fact, they just took his legs off because I don't know, he developed some circulatory problems. She said, "I do have an account of what he did. Unfortunately, page 3 is missing, but I do have that." And I thought that was unusual after 60 years to be able to return a bag to an individual. So that's kind of, it's not an exciting story as far as I'm concerned about my services, but I did see something that probably will never be seen again. That's an occupation of a country that was probably unique in history, the kind of war that we had, World War II. I'm aware that it was every country in the world was involved, probably except 6 or 7. And by the time that war was over, 70 million people had died. But looking back on that era, I grew up in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a vastly different place in those days. We were considered part of the arsenal of democracy. We had the Frankfurt Arsenal, the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. We had the quartermaster. We had Baldwin locomotives, Westinghouse. I mean, the amount of war material coming out of this area was unbelievable. And one incident that happened during World War II that probably bears a little bit of a reminder. Um, that time, segregation was much part of America's experience. And we had what was called the PRT then, which is SEPTA today, Philadelphia Rapid Transit. The trolleys were all, you had to be white to operate a trolley. They had black people working in the yards where they cleaned the trolleys, and did some basic maintenance, but actually to be a conductor on a trolley, you had to be white. Well, with the manpower shortage, they took some of these maintenance workers and turned them in, or tried to train them to be conductors or motormen, they used to call them. Well, the whole system went on strike as resistance to that uh, uh, move by the government or by the SEPTA or PRT to man their trolleys because they were vital to the war effort. Well, of course, this was near the end of the war, and the system went on strike, and Truman, who was president, decided that he could not allow that to happen. So he issued an edict that everybody in Philadelphia, all the conductors and people that work for SEPTA or PRT go back to work, which they refused. So he sent a contingent of army into the city, and they bivouacked with the old municipal stadium. And what they did, they put troops on each trolley to make sure they continued to run. And I believe that unit was sent to Italy, but they not occupied, but they actually were put on the trolleys for about a month to make sure that there was no interruption to the war effort. So I think that's a little interesting.
That
Part of
one I
history.
never heard.
That's true, and I remember going down. I was still in high school then, to the stadium, talking to some of the soldiers that were stationed down there. So there was an incident that could have gotten out of hand, but that was a different time of different era in America when segregation was still part of our culture.
In the few minutes we have left on this tape, quickly tell us what did you do after the war, and then after your occupation duty, and then how did that occupation duty impact your life?
Um, well, it's very interesting. What I did after the war, I come out. I was, of course, still waves of troops were being released, so jobs were hard to come by. And also, we had the GI Bill, which the government, for every month you were in the service, you were allowed to get a month of college free. So I wanted to become a pharmacist. And I don't know why I picked pharmacy, but for one of something else, I went to the Philadelphia School of Pharmacy and Science, and I tried to enroll, which I passed the test. And they said, we have so many enrollees that you'll have to wait. And I believe there was about a 9-month wait before I could enter college. So even though they had a program called the 5220, the demobilization, as you were coming out of the service, you were authorized or enabled to get a $20 a week for 52 weeks to help you until you found a job. Well, I was going to take part of that, and of course, my mother was an old timer, and she says, "No, you're going to go out and find a job, even though you are eligible to get a stipend from the government." So, as an interim, I thought I would get a job, and I got a job as an apprentice printer. But I liked it so much that I never went to college, and did wind up being a very successful career in printing. We printed books and magazines, and that's how I retired as a printer.
And how did the war, how did the occupation experience impact you later on through life?
Um, I had a better feeling, I think, for Asia. That was something, as a kid growing up in Philadelphia, hardly anybody ever thought anything about Asia. But I had an affinity for. I did detect in Japan there was certain beauty to the country, even though there was a lot of destruction. But even the smallest homes had gardens, and I thought, what a difference from what we thought we would find in Japan. Even though there was destruction and hunger, interspersed, and there was a certain sereneness about the whole country. And it left me with a positive image of Japan. where I was, every morning I could see Mount Fuji, and if you kind of closed your eyes to the destruction, you could see that there were certain areas that had a beauty to it. Even the Imperial Palace, which I was stunned with all the destruction in Tokyo, why we did not. There was no damage to the Imperial Palace, and I guess that was by design. I think that probably would have infuriated the Japanese had we killed the emperor. So the palace grounds were pretty big, and there was virtually no damage, and yet most of the city was destroyed. So I think that was also by design. That was probably off limits. Um, so that looking back, I had positive images of Japan, and I thought, well, maybe someday I'll go back. But now when I see the modern Japan, I would not want to go back because that image that I have would be shattered, of course.
Well, Al, thank you so very much for the interview.
Okay.
Today I've been talking with Mr. Al Saggese, um, who served in the occupation force of Japan, 1946 to 47. By the way, today he is a docent, trained docent here in the Battleship New Jersey. And how many tours have you given so far, Al?
Today?
No, in your career as a docent.
Oh, since let's see, this started 2002, was it?
Mhm.
Since then, I guess at least 20 or 30 a season. So quite a few.
A number of hundreds of tours for people. Brought a lot of people to the
Yeah,
ship.
it's hard for me. I mean,
Sure.
going back whenever I'm needed.
And we greatly appreciate that, helping people learn
Okay.
about the Battleship New Jersey, some of its history and history of the military. My name is Dr. Tom Bennett. I'm with the Battleship New Jersey and the Kane University Oral History Project.